Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. Guy Standing is one of the foremost analytical and creative thinkers of our times about the changing conditions of labor and work in the age of globalization. He is a world-renowned expert on economic security or economic insecurity, working conditions, labor, and basic income strategies in developed countries as well as developing countries. Professor Standing is currently at the University of Bath in England, and before that he was the director of the Socioeconomic Security Program at the International Labour Organization, one of the UN organizations headquartered in Geneva. Professor Standing has published prolifically hundreds of articles, many books, and his latest book is The Precariat, which you see over here and which he will talk on tonight. Without any further ado, please welcome Guy Standing back to my home.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'd like to begin by saying that I've reached the stage in life where I'm thinking of offering payment to the chairpersons so that they don't introduce me. It makes me sound very old. So I think I'm going to continue with that thought until I pay somebody. I'd also like to thank Joan Grenier for organizing this, or part organizing it and bringing the books. Now, what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is a new book about a new group that's growing in the world. The book is called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. And a journalist, a prominent British journalist, wrote, "Buy Guy Standing's book or nick it." Now, that's an English expression, if anyone doesn't know it, which means steal it. So I hope that for Joan's sake that they're not stolen this evening. Now, what I'm going to do is briefly address the 5 questions that structure the book. The 5 questions are: what is the precariat? Why care about it? Why is it growing? Who is in the precariat? And where is it taking us as society? And I'd like to begin by mentioning 2 short anecdotes. A few years ago, in Eva's own country, in the city of Hamburg, a group of youths, all dressed up as clowns and in cartoon characters, waltzed into a gourmet supermarket and proceeded to take the biggest trolleys they could find, filled the trolleys with champagne, caviar, smoked salmon, everything they could get of delicacy standard, took pictures of themselves, and waltzed up to the checkout lady, handed her a rose and an envelope, and then promptly they all left the shop without paying. The checkout lady dashed to the owner, handed him the note, and said, "Look, they've all left." He opened the note, and the note said, "We are the precarious workers of Hamburg. We produce the wealth of Hamburg, but we don't get anything. So we're going to distribute all this food to the poor of Hamburg." So the shop owner promptly mobilized the police. They sent 14 police cars searching for this gang, who were hardly inconspicuous, dressed as they were, and they mobilized a helicopter, just in case the cars weren't quick enough, spent vast proportion of the funds of the police force looking for them, and I am delighted to say they were never caught. And they proceeded to distribute the food in the slums of Hamburg and took pictures of themselves and then put it on the internet. And this has gone down as a folklore story, a Robin Hood story, in the growing precariat movement across Europe. But there's another story that relates to the precariat. near where I live in northern Italy, in a city of Prato, which for generations has been a centre for garments and textiles and really a traditional place of craftspeople. It was 100% Italian until 1989 and always voted for the left, political left. And then in 1989, a group of 36 Chinese migrant labourers came through Frankfurt and set up a sweatshop. And over the next 19 years, the population changed dramatically until such a point that 40% of the labour force of Prato consisted of undocumented migrant Chinese in sweatshops. Then the crash suddenly hit. Literally overnight, the left was swept out, the neo-fascist Northern League took over, immediately demonized the migrant Chinese, and with Berlusconi newly re-elected and saying he was going to defeat the army of evil, as he called it, which were the migrants, vigilantes were beating up all the Chinese, and the Chinese ambassador rushed and he said, reminded him of the 1930s. That's the downside of the precariat, one part of it, whereas our youthful, educated Robin Hoods, primitive rebels, are another part. Now, what is the precariat? Well, there are two ways of thinking. One can take a Weberian approach of ideal types and think of groups. And another way of looking at it is to see it as a process of precariatization, a process where modal behavior changes, modal expectations and modal insecurities change. I'm going to take the first approach, but the book tries to do it both ways. Now, what we've seen, and this was the subject of a previous book called Work After Globalization, we have seen under globalization a globalized class structure emerging. At the top, we have an elite, it's not a 1%, it's much smaller than that, of billionaires verging on criminality. We know their names, stride the globe, hugely influential on politics and much else. Below them, you have a salariat doing very nicely with long-term employment security and all the benefits that go with it. And alongside that, an emerging group of professions. These are people who are project-oriented. They don't want employment security. They can deal with their bundles of skills and their contacts and are doing very well, thank you very much. Below them is the shrinking, dying, working class of romantic memory. It's been dying for a long time. Andre Gors wrote a famous book, but it's been shrinking everywhere. Now, the welfare states and the regulatory apparatus of the 20th century were built for that class. And it's below them that we have the emergence of the precariat. The precariat is not at the bottom. Below them are the unemployed and a lumpenized, lumpen precariat. And it's very important, analytically and politically, to realize that the precariat is not an underclass. The precariat was wanted by global capitalism. It is a needed part of the system that is being built, whereas a lumpenized underclass is a drag on accumulation. Now, the precariat is not yet a class for itself in the Marxian sense. It is a class in the making. It exists through a very broad range of insecurities, but it doesn't have a clear vision of where it wants to go, whereas a class for itself does have such a vision. It consists of people who are nomadic, have existential insecurity, they flit in and out of short-term jobs, their incomes fluctuate, and they are more like denizens than citizens. A denizen is an ancient concept that is rarely used, but I think will be increasingly used in the future. A denizen is someone who doesn't have the same range of rights as a citizen, is denied one or more rights by various ways. The Precariat lacks the 7 forms of labour security that I've tried to document in earlier books. But the more interesting characteristics is that people in the Precariat do not have a secure occupational identity. They don't have an occupational narrative that they can give themselves and define themselves as they go through life. They don't have that belonging to a traditional occupation, a craft, or a profession. And this is why people in the Precariat tend not to have what Hannah Arendt said in her wonderful book, The Human Condition of 1957, a sense of social memory. They do not belong to a community of values and ethics and standards handed down from generation to generation, to which they can relate. And this absence of social memory goes together with a sense that there is no shadow of the future hanging over their relations with other people. They don't have a sense of empathy because they cannot easily identify with others, but this absence of a shadow of the future is, I only meet you today, you meet me today. We're never going to meet again, so there's no need to think about reciprocity or social solidarity. You can try and take advantage of me and be more competitive, withhold something or whatever, and I can do the same to you. This real sense of belonging to a lonely crowd where you don't actually feel a sense of common empathy. But the last part of the answer to the first question I want to mention, because it's very, very important later, is that there are varieties of precariat. There are some people who are falling into the precariat from old working class families, traditions, and communities, often relatively uneducated, and therefore easily led astray by the sirens of populism. You can identify those very easily. They're also a middle group, often made up of migrants and others, who treat jobs as instrumental. They're politically detached in many respects. They keep their heads down for various well-known reasons, but they're different from the first category. And the third category tend to be young, educated, cultivated people who are frustrated by the system and frustrated by their insecurities, but are not easily going to be led to a right-wing agenda. It's important to keep those 3 categories in mind. Second question, why care? Why care that a precariat is growing in our societies? Well, there are very good reasons. Obviously, anybody in insecurity is in danger of being marginalized completely. That vulnerability can be summarized in 4 A's. The first A is anxiety. People are anxious and insecure because they're exposed to risks and uncertainty, which you cannot insure against. Chronic uncertainty, which is uninsurable, produces very great insecurity and anxiety. Many people, male as well as female, fear that they're going to become bag ladies or bag men, left living in the street with a couple of bags with all their belongings. Millions of people confess to having those feelings, and it's very important to understand why. The second A is people feel anomic. in the Durkheimian sense of that term, in a sense that they despair of escape. They can hear the politicians and they can hear people say social mobility, meritocracy, but they know actually the probability of moving up is low and declining. They're not fooled. But part of the enemy is the existence of a precariatized mind. More and more people are faced with such insecurity that they have to balance a whole range of activities. They have to network here, they have to use time there, they have to flit here, they have to retrain, they have to do these things. And all the time, they're having to hedge their bets. So they flick. If there's anybody in this room who doesn't understand the precariatized mind, I hope they will give us the recipe, because all of us are feeling those pressures. The third A is a sense of alienation, because too many people are finding they have to do things they do not wish to do, and they cannot do what they would like to do. If that's not a recipe for alienation, I don't know what is. They feel underemployed in the sense they cannot use their skills and their competencies and their aspirations, and they feel overemployed because they have too many things crashing in on them they have to do. It's a pretty bad mix. The fourth A, I think you've probably guessed: anger. The first three is producing a growing, pervasive anger. And that anger can go in various directions. Those three groups in mind, it can go in different ways. The trouble is, the anger is compounded because the precariat does not have a sense of agency at the moment. It doesn't have a voice that it can use inside the system. All right, the third question. Why is the precariat growing? Well, I don't think we should look for a smoking gun. There's not just one factor. But you can see a set of factors that have gradually gathered strength in the past 25, 30 years. The first one, with neoliberalism and globalization, led to what I call a Faustian bargain. The Faustian bargain went something like this. If we open up our economies, liberalize them, we are extending our market system across the world, and in the process, we are trebling our world's labor supply to the open market system. Trebling. You're adding 1.5 billion extra workers. And that 1.5 billion workers, all of them, from China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, were prepared to work or labor for 1/30th of the wages in the United States or Britain or Europe or other rich countries. In that circumstance, I'm an economist. If there isn't an economist who wouldn't tell you that there's going to be a convergence. You cannot expect the productivity levels to shoot up in the rich countries and not shoot up in Chindia. So either the good jobs all flush down to the new countries, or our wages and benefits plunge. Politically, neither was sustainable. And therefore, the Faustian bargain was made. The Faustian bargain essentially said, we will top up declining real wages by a mixture of labor subsidies and tax credits. So the earned income tax credit in this country became the biggest welfare program in the world. You top it up. Now, a Faustian bargain, by definition, can only go on for so long, because all the time you are postponing the day of reckoning by building up the debts and by people running down their own savings. And of course, the day of reckoning came with the financial crash. I think it's wrong to blame the bankers, because the system was designed to make inequality much greater. It was designed that way. It was designed to shift the risks onto workers and to produce a growing precariat. The second issue, which is what I talked about last time as it happens, is the growth of three forms of labour market flexibility. Now, I'm going to be very brief on that because it's dealt with in the books, and anybody who's interested can look at that. But essentially the three forms were numerical flexibility, whereby governments were told or led the way in taking away employment security from workers. In doing so, they made it easier to hire and fire, lowering protections against unfair dismissal and so on, encouraging the growth of temporaries, encouraging the outsourcing, etc., all the stuff you're familiar with. Once you've done that, you're never going to reverse the trend. I think that's a key lesson. A second form is wage system flexibility. Now, wage system flexibility meant two things. It meant lowering real wages and making them more flexible, i.e. likely to decline. But it also, more importantly, meant a gradual stripping away of the forms of social income outside the wage. So enterprise benefits and state benefits that made up a large part of total income were gradually taken away from the emerging precariat. Meanwhile, the salariat went on gaining them all the time. Longer paid holidays, paid this, paid that, subsidized transport, subsidized housing, you name it, you know it better than I do. What that meant was that the actual growth of income inequality understated the growth of social income inequality. Because not only did you have a widening of wage differentials, you had a big widening in access to non-wage forms of remuneration. Now, while this happened, something else happened which was very painful. As it happened, I've just come across from the United Kingdom, and I got dragged into a seminar with a couple of government ministers and one of the leaders of the opposition. And I focused on this aspect, and all the social workers in the audience said, that's what's happening. What has happened is everywhere they went towards means testing social assistance. Now, means testing means that only if you're poor do you get a benefit, which is a means of putting you into a poverty trap. If you are poor and if you are receiving a benefit, then there is a disincentive for you to take a low-wage job. Now, in many countries with means-tested social assistance, effectively the poor and the precariat face a poverty trap of something like 80%. In other words, if they go from a benefit situation into a low-wage job, they're going to lose 80% of what they gain. Now, meanwhile, as Warren Buffett will be the first to tell us, the middle class and the rich are all bellyaching about paying 40%, in his case 17%. And the argument of the politicians is we cannot have higher taxes on the middle class because if we do, that would act as a disincentive for them working. So tut-tut, we must lower their tax rates. Meanwhile, the precariat is facing marginal tax rate of double what the rich are paying. But the situation gets worse, much worse. Because with a poverty trap and assistance, along come the social reformers, the utilitarians, and say, look, we have to separate the deserving poor from the undeserving poor. Because some people are poor because they're lazy or they're whatever, you know, the scroungers. So we have to have tests to determine whether they're really deserving of help. And what they do is that one test leads to another test. The latest I've heard in this country, and apologies for saying it, but it seems so well, terrible, is that they're now going to introduce urine tests in 33 states to determine whether you, as a claimant, have actually taken drugs of some sort in the past 6 months, 9 months, or whatever. And to make it really demeaning, you'll have to pay for your own urine tests. Now, that sort of thing not only is disgusting and demonizing the poor, but think what it does. It makes gaining entitlement to a benefit much harder. And it makes retaining entitlement much harder. So what happens is that people, and there are millions and millions and millions of such people, have to enter a queuing process to try and gain access to benefits once they lose their job. In many countries, it takes 2, 3, 4 months before a person actually gets entitlement to a benefit and receives it. Now, supposing you've run down your friends, you've used up your friends, you've used up your savings, you've gone into debt, you can't pay your rent, etc. And then along comes a nice, friendly, privatized employment exchange person who is paid by putting people into jobs. The number he can get into jobs, the more he gets. And he says, look, in South Hadley, we found, at the other side of the town, we found a temporary, low-paying job. It might last for 3 weeks, but we think you should go for it. Now, you remember, you've got your poverty trap, and you've got the precarity trap. Because the precarity trap thinking is, if I go for that 3-week job, I might lose it very quickly and have to start all over again trying to pass all those tests, prove that those slippers under my bed don't belong to a breadwinner and not me, etc. So you've created poverty traps and precarity traps. And there's only one way that the state can go when it's faced with those two things. And that's the way it has gone, which has gone for Workfare, the famous Wisconsin model that is now exported to my own country. So one of the gurus of it is now advising David Cameron in Downing Street. And his motto is, we have to encourage the unemployed to blame themselves for their unemployment. So you've got to the end game of this process of a Faustian bargain. Millions more being tipped into it, and a precarity trap and poverty trap really making them very angry at the bottom. But there are other forms of flexibility that have contributed. Functional flexibility is when people have to move from job to job. They lose control of their ability to define their occupation. And in this regard, one of the most important things that's happened under globalization is that there has been systemic labor market re-regulation. Any teacher of labor economics who mentions the word labor market deregulation should be sent off to do something else because they don't know what they're talking about. Throughout this period, what happened in particular that's relevant to the growth of the precariat is you had occupational dismantling. At the beginning of the era, there was still a common sense of self-regulation with the old guilds, professional guilds, craft guilds. One can be critical of those. They had certain monopolistic tendencies, but what they did do is reproduce the ethics and values and standards over generations. But what the state did was re-regulate by taking control away from the occupational bodies themselves and putting control in boards and licensing systems. So if I give the United States as a statistic, in 1980, fewer than 1 in 20 American workers was subject to licensing. They needed a license of some sort in order to do their occupation. Today, it's more than 1 in every 3. That's a fundamental change in which the restructuring of occupational regulation has dramatically increased the power of the state. But in doing so, it has actually increased the fragmentation of occupations. It has resulted in the splintering of them. It has resulted in the oppression of certain categories, which I went to in great detail in this book, and it has led to the growth of a precariatized mass alongside an elite who are going up in stratosphere, dealing with celebrities and so on. And just to give one example, so you get the picture of what is happening, in my own country, in 2007, they got the big one, the legal profession. And they introduced the Legal Services Act. Now, the Legal Services Act put control of the bar, the lawyers and all the professionals, in a state body headed by a non-lawyer with terms of reference. You have to go for competitiveness, market clearing, consumer, never mind the providers. Well, most of us don't like lawyers, and therefore we think, well, got them. But it's being called the Tesco law. And the reason it's called the Tesco law, Tesco is a well-known supermarket chain in Britain. And henceforth, you will be able to go into Tesco's or any supermarket of your choice, and you'll be able to go up to somebody dressed in a nice white tunic with legal services assistant written on their lapel, and you'll be able to go up and you say, look, today I would like a divorce. All right, well, if you go over there, what sort of divorce? No contest divorce? If you go over there, you press the key buttons, and you'll get a standardized form, and if you sign it in duplicate, then you'll be able to get a divorce in a couple of weeks. You want a will? Well, you better go over there and fill in this form and press these buttons. I'm joking not, because the lawyers have admitted that this is going to happen, and it is already happening. So you're going to get, and you are getting, a huge growth of paralegal people. Just as there are paramedical and para-educational and para this and para that. And these paras will never have the opportunity to move out of a para status. It is a very key part of occupational dismantling. The next factor is something closer to home. So I apologize if I offend the sensibilities of some of the professors in the room. We have seen a steady process of educational commodification. Increasingly, both at tertiary level and even at secondary level, we are expected to produce 2 commodities. The first one is degrees, and the second one are graduates. And we have to channel people through. And we're preparing people for the job market. All subversive critical thinking that is the essence of higher education suddenly becomes slightly irrelevant for preparing people for a market society. We are expected to produce docile minds and docile bodies who can be functional. But in a sense, this commodification is leading to more and more people being given those certificates and being sold a false prospectus. I'm not saying that's at Mount Holyoke. I'm sure you're one of the few kicking the trend. But the false prospectus is, you're going to university to prepare you for a career, to prepare you for something that you will feel proud about as you go through life. But more and more people are realizing that is a false prospectus because they're actually buying a lottery ticket. The lottery ticket where there are a few winners who are big winners, and most people are coming out with a ticket that's worth less and less. That's putting it strongly, but there is a powerful trend. So you have the growth of teacherless universities, which is a contradiction in terms. You have prominent universities closing their philosophy departments, which is a contradiction in terms. I know a professor who failed 2 students. He was called in by his dean and said, "You can't do that." He said, "I'm sorry, but they were no good." He said, "You can't fail them, but they were no good." Look, Jim, go home for the weekend, think about it, because if it gets out that we fail students, the reputation of our university will suffer and fewer people will come to our university. Think about it over the weekend, Jim. You have a responsibility. Jim came back on the Monday and said, "I'm sorry, but they failed." So the dean said, "The vice-chancellor would like to see you." He went to see the vice-chancellor, and I think you can guess the end of the story. He got sacked. He took the university to court, he won damages, but he didn't get his job back. Now we're moving in strange times, but a lot of educated young people are emerging from their education system feeling very frustrated, a status frustration, and at the same time knowing that the system is leaving them exposed to an educational bubble. They've incurred vast debts. Student debt in this country has multiplied 7-fold in the last decade. And they are getting value less and less from those tickets. It's a contributing factor. The last factor I want to mention is something that I hope someone will do a PhD, maybe hope several. We do not have a good concept of tertiary time. In an industrial society, life was lived in blocks. You got up in the morning, you went to labor for 10 hours or 12 hours or whatever it was, you went home, dropped to sleep. You got up as a child, if you were lucky, you went to school for a few years, you labored for 30 years, you had 2 years in retirement, dead. Blocks of time. But in a tertiary society, we do not have any sense of control over time. And more people have to spend more and more time doing work for labor. Work that they have to undertake for which they're not remunerated, but which if they don't undertake, they risk losing out in the competitive market. The consultants tell us that all of us must spend at least 15% of your time every year retraining. We have to spend an enormous amount of time dealing with financial matters, dealing with the bureaucracies, dealing with job certs, updating your resumes every 3 months, networking with different groups. They're all work. To say they're not work is to misuse the English language. But in that process, just think what it's like if you're in the precariat. Because the precariat has to do much more work for labor and work for reproduction than someone who's in the salariat and someone who can buy expertise to deal with the various challenges of ordinary civilized living. The precariat, just for this precariatized mind, has to flit between activities. The amount of transaction costs for the precariat dealing with the bureaucracies facing them is enormous. It's very stressful, and you have to realize that a lot of the people in the precariat are mentally on the edge. They're suffering from some disability. They're suffering from the fact that they don't have any other income, but they've got a small child to support. All the things that make time use so incredibly important. Now that contributes to a precariatized existence. Because of time, I'm going to deal with the next chapter very briefly. Who is in the precariat? In principle, all of us. All of us at any stage could end up in the precariat. A TV producer recently, I did an interview, and the next morning, I didn't know the producer, major program. He called me up the next morning and he said, "Look, Guy, I just want to tell you that I feel like I'm joining the precariat any day now." And he was a well-established person. But there is a sense in which many of us feel that we're only an accident away. We're only a mishap away from being in the precariat. But, of course, there are certain groups in society that have a much higher probability than others. Youth, educated youth, I've already alluded to, you understand that. Women obviously have always been suffering from the triple burdens and all those things that we know about. And the very fact that women are taking a growing proportion of all jobs is only because more of the jobs are becoming precariatized in character, and that is why women are gaining their share. But the bag lady syndrome is a very international phenomenon that a lot of women experience. Old agers are a funny bunch in the sense that some of them are grinners as they enter the precariat. They don't want a career, they just want to feel active and have something to do. But there are also the groaners who are without a good pension, without any security, and they have to live precariously into their old age. But the biggest group in the precariat are the migrants. Today we have more migrants than at any time in human history. The official number is 214 million, but that doesn't include the millions and millions of undocumented who get demonized and called illegals. The migrants are the light infantry of capitalism, but unlike the last period of migration, of mass migration, a century ago into the New World, primarily the United States, most migration these days is circular. People being almost nomadic rather than settlers going from one culture to another. So many more people are denizens. I won't go into the other characteristics except to highlight one development that has not been given any attention as far as I know. We have the emergence of new labor export regimes. A labor export regime is a country which systematically organizes the mass movement of workers on a project basis around the world. So you find that China is sending hundreds of thousands of people on short-term projects around from country to country. Hundreds of thousands are convicts. They are only sent because they are convicts. India is changing and doing it too, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. We're talking about a major sense of movement. But don't think it's only going into Africa, Latin America, and Asia, because increasingly it's going into the rich industrialized countries. To give you one example, recently the Polish government put out to tender its highway system to be renovated. The tender was won by a Chinese state corporation. And one of the conditions was that it would bring its own workers into Poland. But the irony is that they received a subsidy from the European Union in order to cheapen it so that they could do that. They're now doing it in the Greek ports, the Portuguese ports, as part of the price to help them, these indebted countries out, and in Italy. And there was a poem that was observed on the door of a dormitory of one of these groups of migrants. And the poem in Mandarin was, "We are all people floating around in the world. We meet each other, but we never really get to know each other." That seems to me a fantastic poem for the precariat. That leads to my last question. Where is it leading us? Well, the penultimate chapter is called A Politics of Inferno, and the final chapter is called A Politics of Paradise, with apologies to Dante. The Politics of Inferno is essentially the continuation of the existing trends. Let's trace it forward. We have societies of yawning inequality. We have societies where more and more people, not just migrants, are denizens, denied some rights by some circumstance or other. We have an erosion of privacy. We have the growth of a panopticon society where data surveillance is used to control people and to penalize people. We have workfare spreading so that a growing number of people are coerced to take really undignified forms of labor. And we have the growth of libertarian paternalism. Our modern policymakers are nothing else but utilitarians, and they've forgotten to read Bentham's Panopticon papers. The happiness of the majority goes very nicely with the misery of the minority, and if that helps to make the majority feel happier, we'll do it. But libertarian paternalism and nudge is very pernicious. Everybody should study it and make up their mind where they stand. Because the essence of libertarian paternalism is, you lot out there, and me too, have too much information. You can't make rational choices yourself. So we, the experts, the state, will nudge you to make the right choice. And if you don't make the right choice, then you will pay for it. Now, when Barack Obama, and I hope he's re-elected, when Barack Obama was elected, he appointed one of the authors of Nudge as a regulator, chief regulator in the White House. When David Cameron was elected Prime Minister last year, he appointed the other co-author as an advisor in Downing Street, and they've set up what's called the Nudge Unit. And the Deputy Prime Minister was sufficiently impressed that he actually said, we are going to make sure people make the right choices for society. Well, I don't need to spell it out where that leads. We have the worst thing of this politics of inferno, and that is a drift to a neo-fascist populism. The populists with their charisma, their buzzwords, their money from the elite, luring people into thinking that the problem is the government and the migrants, or the Roma, or the Catholics, or the Muslims, or whatever group you want to demonize wherever you are the problems. That neo-fascism is not a minority thing anymore. It is a growing phenomenon almost everywhere. If you live in Europe, you see it in every single country. You see the equivalent of the Tea Party and all the disgraceful types. We thought we'd seen the end of that forever. But I'm afraid to say that part of the precariat, and those fearing they're falling into the precariat, are being lured into finding that agenda rather attractive. It is a real fear. And it will only be combated when we have a genuine politics of paradise to put against it. I believe it is emerging. I believe, and that's why the long last chapter goes into some of the possibilities, I believe that we are gradually going to move from the primitive rebels phase of resistance to what is going on. We're seeing the Occupy Wall Street, we're seeing the events in Syntagma Square in Athens, I was speaking in Madrid, we're seeing it in Milano, we're seeing the Euro May Day parades, we're seeing precariat movements emerging which are saying, no, we do not need to have this insecurity, we do not need to have the inequalities. But the movement has got to have a positive agenda. And that positive agenda is what I try and spell out. I will not go into it now because I've overused my time, and also because I hope some of you will be sufficiently motivated to read the book. But I tell you this, that the only way we are going to avoid the worst of the politics of Inferno is if we collectively start taking action ourselves. Only when the precariat becomes a class for itself, a realization that we must act as agency and we must work for a much better form of society, will we stop what's been going on. Unless that happens, then the years ahead are going to be bad. But I think that the politicians of the centre left and centre, have suddenly woken up and are realizing that they have no clothes. Everywhere, the Social Democrats, Social Democrat inclination, Labour parties and so on, have been losing. And they've been losing for very, very good reasons. I have no sorry for them. Many of them are my friends. But for too long, they went along with the neoliberal economic agenda. For too long, they refused to address inequality, and they accepted the Faustian Bargain. But now, they're suddenly getting very worried because this far-right monster is growing. And the precariat is a dangerous class in the double sense. It's dangerous because it could go over there, but it's dangerous too to the political middle because it's not interested in that old agenda. I think that makes it a very exciting development, and I hope that we will become active and more optimistic in the future. Thank you very much for listening.